Hello, and welcome to your first video of the Child Development class. Each week, you're going to watch one of these videos as a way to help you get into the material of the course. In the first video, we're going to cover a couple of different kinds of topics. First, we're going to talk about the purpose of these videos generally, and then we'll cover the basic concepts of the Child Development course in terms of what we're going to cover and a little bit about how. After that, we'll also cover a little bit about prenatal development because that's the first topic we're going to cover in the second day of this week. We'll wrap up at the end by addressing the idea of clinical assessment, which is something that we'll talk about a bit in class and use throughout class, and then we'll end with some big questions that you should keep in mind throughout the whole course. The purpose of these videos. So we have two purposes for making these videos. The first is to give you a preview of the content. We recommend that you watch these videos before you start reading for each week. This will give you a broad idea of what's going to be covered and will help you focus your attention on some of the most important topics within that reading. The second goal is to give you some big questions to focus on while you're reading. These might be questions that are major debates in the field, or specific questions that we'll be covering in class, just to give you a hint about what things you should be attending to. Here's your first hint. The big questions can be a great jumping off point for what you write in your weekly discussion question. So if you keep an eye on those questions, that should help you out with those discussion board posts. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about what the purpose of the child development class is. The course will cover development from prenatal period through the adolescence period. That means that we'll look at development from the time the person is in utero up through when they're about 18. Of course, development happens all along that time and doesn't end at age 18, but this is where our course will sort of end. In this class, we'll also be talking about clinical implications of what we're learning in child development. We'll do that by spotlighting some age-appropriate clinical practices or interventions for each age group that we talk about, and we'll also use case analyses in watching videos and in reading texts to help you practice looking for developmental milestones that we're talking about and to hone your sort of observation and assessment skills. Do keep in mind this isn't a clinical course. So we're not focusing on teaching you clinical practice the way that your practice courses will. Instead, we just wanted to help you think about these topics as important and to think about how you will bring them in to the clinical room and bring in what you're learning. In this course, we will use what is called a biopsychosocial framework. That means that we'll think about the biological, social, and psychological elements that impact a child's development. For example, when we think about learning to walk, obviously, there are biological elements like developing strong enough muscles and appropriate brain connections. There are also social impacts. For instance, whether or how much a child is allowed to crawl around, or what cultural beliefs there are around when children should be crawling or what they should be focusing on. We'll also talk about psychological influences. For instance, think about a very anxious parent who might be very afraid of their child falling or getting hurt or being away from them, and how that might impact when a child starts to walk or move independently in the world. So we use this framework throughout. Your textbook mostly focuses on the bottom two, using biocultural model is what they call it. So biological and social impacts. So we'll be supplementing those psychological elements since, this is a clinical program. Here's a little bit more about how we'll do that and how we'll be thinking about clinical implications in particular. I've mentioned that we'll weave those into the course. And first of all, we invite you to always be thinking about the clinical implications of what we're teaching. You can think about that both in terms of how you would work with a child in this age, or how you would think about experiences of this age in an adult that you're seeing, because, all adults are just former kids. So we all bring those experiences of childhood into our adult life, and the more you can understand where a child is developmentally when they're telling you about something that happened in their childhood, or when you're thinking about things that might have happened in their childhood, we also want to invite you to think about how that would impact your clinical work. Like I said, we'll be providing supplemental articles that will emphasize these clinical elements, and we really encourage you to make sure that you focus on that. They will bring in sometimes a specific skill and sometimes just a topic that we want to make sure you hit or cover, so make sure you get a good time to focus on reading those parts of the required reading. All right, so that's the basics of the course. That talks about the clinical parts and also the basics of the developmental part that we will continue to elaborate on all term. Now I'm going to briefly turn to talking about prenatal development to prepare you for that section of class. So after our first introductory class, we will spend one class talking about prenatal development. That's the period from when we're a few cells to when we're a full-size fetus ready to be born. We'll also talk a little bit about birth. And we'll talk about biological elements. For instance, in this chart, actually what it's showing is what parts of the fetus are developing at any time, and in turn, what is the most sort of vulnerable part to any potential toxins or outside environmental factors that could impact that part of the development. So if you were wondering, why would I, as a clinician, ever need to know about the biological part of prenatal development? No one's doing therapy with babies in utero. That's true. But we are thinking about how what's happening around a person who is pregnant in the world can be impacting a fetus, even at this biological level. So those things are important to know. At the same time, we'll also be talking about social and psychological elements of prenatal development. Those things include things like the parent's psychological experience of pregnancy and also their developing relationship with that fetus, and cultural practices around beliefs about pregnancy, what should and shouldn't be done, and about birth, about how we understand the role of a fetus or a newborn baby in a family. So we'll talk about those as well. And that gives you an overview of what you'll be reading about in the prenatal development section. Now I want to talk briefly about assessment. So the last thing you'll be reading about for this week and that we'll be covering in class is the basics of clinical assessment with children. The article about this covers several elements of what you'll be doing as you assess a child at an intake or in a clinical situation. It gives you examples of, you'll notice, psychological, social, and biological elements, right? The psychological functioning, that parent-child relationship, and the child's developmental progress. And this should give you a great window into how you'll be bringing in what you learn all term in this course into that clinical room, what you're going to be needing to know to be able to do a good, thorough, appropriate assessment of a child so that you know how to move forward clinically. We'll be using these skills that this article talks about throughout the whole course, so it's important to read it now to get ready for that time. All right, and so now we've arrived at the big questions for class. These are a few things that you can hold on to all term to think about and to help shape sort of the questions that you're thinking about as you're reading, as you're writing, and participating in class. The first of those is, how can knowing about child development influence your clinical practice with children or with adults? Another one is thinking about biological, social, and psychological factors impacting prenatal development, right? That's something you can think about in this prenatal chapter and all the way through the class. And then finally, what knowledge do you need to conduct an assessment of a child? What are some things to be looking for, or some things that you want to be learning in this class so that you can do this successfully? So those are some big questions to think about as you jump into the reading this week and jump into the course overall, and we look forward to seeing you in class.